The wine glass was already at my lips when I noticed it. My husband's glass, mine, side by side on the kitchen counter, identical stemware, same dark Melbeek swirling in both. The only difference was that his had a small chip on the rim. I'd been meaning to throw it out for months. That chip saved my life. I know that now. But on that Sunday evening in October, standing in my mother-in-law's kitchen with a smile plastered across my face and a dull headache already building behind my eyes, I still believed the problem was me. It started the previous spring. Every Sunday, my husband's family did dinner. That was just how it was. His mother, Vivian, hosted at the house he'd grown up in, a sprawling craftsman in Naperville, Illinois, with a garden she was endlessly proud of, and a dining room table that seated 12. My husband, Trevor, was the second of 3 kids. His older brother, Garrett, usually came with his wife, and his younger sister, Simone, always came alone. I was the outsider who'd married in. I knew that. I'd known it since the rehearsal dinner when Vivian handed me a glass of champagne and said, with a perfectly pleasant smile, "We're so glad Trevor finally found someone stable." I'd laughed, because what else do you do with a comment like that? Trevor and I had been married 2 years by then. We'd met at a work conference in Chicago. He was in commercial real estate. I was doing contract compliance for a mid-size firm in the Loop. We were practical people. That's what I told myself. We communicated clearly, argued productively, split the bills down the middle. I thought that was love. I thought that was enough. Sunday dinners were non-negotiable for Trevor. His word, not mine. Non-negotiable. So I went. Every week I drove 40 minutes out to Naperville, sat at that long table, passed the bread basket, asked Vivian about her garden, and drank exactly 1 glass of wine with dinner because that was the polite thing to do. And every Sunday night, somewhere around 9 p.m., I'd feel it. A heaviness first, not tiredness exactly, something heavier, like the air pressure had changed. Then my thoughts would go soft, like trying to remember a word that keeps sliding away. By the time we were in the car heading home, I was usually fighting to keep my eyes open. Trevor always drove. I always apologized for being so exhausted. He always said not to worry about it. By June, I'd started dreading Sundays. I told my doctor I thought I might be anemic. She ran blood panels. Everything came back normal. I started taking B12 supplements, then iron anyway, then melatonin on the theory that maybe my sleep schedule was just off. Nothing changed. My mother called once and I told her I'd been having these strange episodes of exhaustion on Sunday evenings, and she said, "Honey, maybe you just don't like those dinners and your body is telling you." I laughed it off. I'm a grown woman. I don't let my nervous system make my social calendar decisions, but I started paying closer attention. It wasn't every Sunday. It was every Sunday that I drank the wine. I didn't notice this for months because I always drank the wine. It was just what you did at Vivian's table. She'd pour, you'd accept. Refusing felt rude. But in late August, I had a minor dental procedure on a Friday, and my dentist told me to avoid alcohol for a few days while I was on antibiotics. That Sunday, I showed up at dinner, declined the wine with a brief explanation about medication, and drank sparkling water all evening. I drove home myself. I felt completely fine. I filed that away and told myself it was a coincidence. The next Sunday, I drank the wine again. By 8:30, I was slumped against the passenger window while Trevor navigated the highway, asking me something about whether we should refinance the condo, and I couldn't form a coherent sentence to respond. That's when I started to get scared. Not at Trevor, not at anyone in particular. Just scared in a formless way. The way you get scared when your body does something you don't understand. I skipped the wine 2 more times over the next month. Twice I stayed sharp all evening. Twice I drove home myself, talked with Trevor in the car, stayed up past midnight without effort. And twice Trevor seemed almost irritated when I declined. The second time he said, "My mom picks these out specially, you know. It's a little rude." I apologized. I drank the wine the following Sunday. I woke up at Vivian's house at midnight with no memory of falling asleep. I want to be careful here about how I describe the next part because even now, looking back with everything I know, I can feel how slowly I arrived at the obvious conclusion. You have to understand, I was not looking for betrayal. I had no framework for it. Trevor was not a dramatic person. He paid his portion of the mortgage on time. He texted me when he was running late. He brought home exactly the kind of takeout I'd mentioned wanting 3 days earlier, unprompted because he'd written it down in his phone. He was not the kind of man who seemed capable of anything. That's the part no one tells you. The men who are capable of this are, first, the men who seem incapable of it. I started tracking it. I know that sounds clinical, but I'd always been a notes on my phone person. Grocery lists, to-do items, things I didn't want to forget. I started adding a line after every Sunday dinner. Drank wine. Episode. Duration, 4 hours. Or declined wine. Normal. Drove home. After 6 entries, it was undeniable even to me. I didn't confront Trevor. Something stopped me, some instinct I couldn't name at the time that told me confronting him was the wrong move before I understood what was actually happening. Instead, I started watching. Vivian poured the wine herself, always. She'd come out from the kitchen with the bottle and go around the table. Trevor's glass first, then Garrett's wife, then Simone, then me, always last. The bottle came from the kitchen. One Sunday in September, I volunteered to help Vivian with dinner. She seemed surprised. I hadn't done that before, but pleased. I set the table, carried dishes, moved in and out of the kitchen, and I watched her open a new bottle of Malbec, pour the first glass for herself to taste, and set it on the counter. Then she stepped out to tell everyone dinner was ready. She was gone maybe 90 seconds. Simone came in from the back door. I was at the far end of the kitchen near the refrigerator, and I don't think she saw me immediately. She went straight to the counter. I watched her reach into the pocket of her cardigan. I watched her tip something into one of the poured glasses, a glass that had already been set aside, away from the others. Then she heard me shift my weight and looked up. We stared at each other. "Oh," she said, "I didn't know you were in here." "Just helping," I said. My voice was completely flat. "I don't know how I did that." She smiled, put her hand back in her pocket. "I was just checking if Vivian needed anything." I nodded. I watched her leave. And then I stood very still in that kitchen for a long moment because I understood, with a clarity I hadn't expected to feel, that that glass on the counter, the one set slightly apart, was mine. I did not drink the wine that night. I said I had a headache, which was not entirely untrue. I watched Trevor's face when I declined. There was something there, a flicker, so fast I would have missed it if I hadn't been looking. And then it was gone, replaced by his usual expression of mild concern. "You've been getting a lot of headaches lately," he said. "You should go back to the doctor." "You're right," I said. "I will." On the drive home, I pretended to doze in the passenger seat. He turned the radio on low. I lay there with my eyes almost closed, and I thought, what is in that glass? What is in that glass? What has been in every glass for the past 6 months? And what happens if I go to the police with nothing but a pattern I noticed and a woman I watched put her hand in her pocket? The answer was nothing. Nothing happens. I'd just be a wife making accusations about her husband's family with no evidence. I needed evidence. I didn't go to the police first. I went to a pharmacist friend from college. I'll call her my friend because that's what she is, though I'm leaving her name out of this. And I described the symptoms. The heaviness, the cognitive fog, the duration, the consistency. She listened and then she said, "That sounds like it could be a sedative. Depending on the dose, something like zolpidem would do exactly that." Onset around 30 minutes, duration 4 to 6 hours, clears the system fast. Would it show up on a standard blood panel? Not unless they're specifically testing for it. And not if enough time has passed. I thanked her and hung up the phone and sat in my car in the parking lot of the Whole Foods near our condo for a long time. Then I called a private investigator. His name was Walt. He was referred by a family attorney I found through my firm's HR department. I told HR I needed a referral for estate planning purposes, which wasn't entirely false, as it turned out. Walt was in his late 50s, matter of fact, not unkind. When I told him what I'd observed, he didn't tell me I was paranoid or that there was a reasonable explanation. He just said, "Okay, what do you want to know?" "I want to know what my husband and his sister are doing and why." He got back to me in 11 days. Trevor had taken out a life insurance policy on me 14 months earlier, $2 million. He had listed himself as the primary beneficiary. He had not mentioned this policy to me. I had signed the medical release as part of a routine health screening at his office. I remember him asking me to bring my insurance card and sign a few things for the company wellness program. I had signed without reading carefully because I trusted him. The policy had a 2-year contestability clause, which meant the insurance company could investigate and deny a claim if the policyholder died within the first 2 years of the policy. We were at 14 months. In 6 weeks, we would cross 2 years. Walt also found that Trevor and Simone had been in contact far more frequently than a brother and sister with a pleasant but unremarkable relationship would explain. Daily calls, texts every few hours. He hadn't been able to pull the content of those communications, but the frequency told its own story. I sat across from Walt in his office in downtown Chicago and I said, "I need this to be airtight before I do anything." He nodded. Then we document. The next Sunday, I went to dinner as usual. I had a small digital recorder in my jacket pocket. Walt had advised me that Illinois is a one-party consent state for recording conversations. I only needed my own consent to record a conversation I was part of. I wasn't going to do anything reckless. I wasn't going to go anywhere alone with Trevor. I was just going to have dinner and pay attention and record whatever I could. At the table, Vivian poured. I accepted my glass. I did not drink from it. I watched Simone across the table. She was relaxed, laughing at something Garrick said, refilling her own glass. She had no idea I'd seen her. No idea I'd been paying attention for weeks. I thought about the woman I'd been 8 months ago, apologizing for my exhaustion, taking B12 supplements, worrying about my health, and something hardened in me. After dinner, I helped clear the table. Garrett and his wife left early. Trevor and his mother moved to the living room, and I found myself in the kitchen alone with Simone for about 4 minutes while she loaded the dishwasher. 4 minutes was enough. I told her I'd been having a lot of trouble sleeping lately, that I'd actually been prescribed something, a sleep aid, and that I was worried about whether it interacted with wine, which was why I'd been drinking so carefully. I watched her face. "What kind?" she asked. Very casually. "Zolpidem," I said. "Have you heard of it?" She kept her eyes on the dishwasher. "I think so. I'm sure a little wine would be fine." "Do you think so?" I said. I wasn't sure if it built up in the system, like if someone had been taking it for a while. She turned and looked at me then. Something moved across her face, just for a second, and I held her gaze and smiled. She smiled back. "I wouldn't worry about it," she said. I excused myself to use the bathroom. In the hallway, I stopped the recording. Walt brought in a colleague who specialized in financial investigations. What they found over the next 3 weeks was this. Trevor had been quietly liquidating joint assets. A brokerage account we'd opened together, funded mostly from my bonuses over the past 2 years, had been transferred to a new account in his name alone in March, 7 months earlier. The transfer had happened while I was traveling for work. He'd forged my signature on the transfer paperwork. The account held $214,000. There was also the matter of the condo. We were both on the mortgage, but he had contacted a real estate attorney about buyout options. Specifically, what would happen to a jointly owned property if one spouse died intestate. I did not cry when Walt told me this. I want to be honest about that. I think I'd used up the part of me that needed to cry somewhere in those weeks of sitting in parking lots and driving 40 minutes each way to a house I'd never felt welcome in. What I felt instead was something colder and much more focused. I called the family attorney. And then I went to the police. The detective I spoke with was a woman named Kowalski, which I found quietly reassuring for reasons I can't fully explain. She listened to everything. She listened to the recording. She reviewed the documentation Walt had compiled. She said, "This is solid. Not enough for an arrest yet, but enough to open an investigation." What do I do in the meantime? You act normal, she said. You go to Sunday dinner. You don't confront anyone. You let us work. Acting normal was the hardest thing I've ever done. 3 weeks later, Kowalski's team executed a search warrant on Simon's apartment. They found a prescription bottle of zolpidem prescribed to a patient at the physical therapy practice where Simone worked as an administrative coordinator, a patient who had died 3 months earlier. They found search history on her laptop. They found text messages that the warrant allowed them to pull. The messages between Simone and Trevor, spanning 19 months, described everything: the plan, the timeline, the policy, the progression from a sedative to, after the 2-year mark, something stronger, which Trevor had apparently already sourced and which was found in a bag in the back of his home office closet. Simone's lawyer later argued she was coerced. She wasn't. The texts made that very clear. Trevor was arrested on a Wednesday morning. I know this because I was at work when Kowalski called me, and I walked to the women's bathroom and stood in a stall for about 10 minutes before I could make my hands stop shaking. Simone was arrested the same afternoon. The charges against Trevor included conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, because the zolpidem had in fact been administered to me on at least 9 documented occasions, which the prosecution established through toxicological analysis of samples I'd provided under medical supervision, wire fraud, forgery, and financial elder abuse due to an unrelated matter that came out during the financial investigation I won't get into here. Simone was charged with conspiracy, procurement of a controlled substance, and administering a controlled substance without consent. The life insurance company launched its own investigation and found the policy had been taken out under fraudulent pretenses. They voided it and referred the case to their legal team. Vivian was not charged. I believe she didn't know. I can't fully explain why I believe that, except that I watched her face in the courtroom, and I think some things are simply true. I filed for divorce immediately. The condo sold 9 months later. I got back the $214,000 plus interest through a civil judgment that took 14 months to resolve, but it resolved. Trevor pled guilty to 3 of the charges to avoid trial. He was sentenced to 22 years without the possibility of parole on the attempted murder charge, with concurrent sentences on the remaining counts. His attorney argued it down from the prosecution's ask. I sat in that courtroom and I watched him read his prepared statement, and I thought, I drove 40 minutes every Sunday and apologized for being tired. Simone received a 12-year sentence. I live in Portland now, Oregon, not Maine, though Maine has crossed my mind once or twice. I chose Portland because I had a friend there, because I'd never lived anywhere but the Midwest, because I needed to be somewhere that had never been ours. I'm 32. I have a 1-bedroom apartment with a window that faces a courtyard and a small desk where I work remotely 3 days a week. I have a cat named Edmund who is deeply unimpressed by everything. I have a therapist I see on Tuesdays who has helped me understand that what I survived was a slow, quiet, methodical attempt to erase me, and that surviving it does not mean I have to be grateful for the person it made me. I still keep notes on my phone, grocery lists, things I want to remember, observations I don't want to lose. It is the same habit that helped me see the pattern when no one else was looking. I think about that a lot, how close I came to never seeing it. How many Sundays I sat at that table and apologized. I don't drink milk anymore. I don't think I will again. But I do drink wine sometimes on a Friday evening, alone or with my friend who lives 12 blocks from me, and it tastes like exactly what it is. Just wine, just Friday, just my life, which is mine again. I did not need anyone to hand it back to me. I took it back myself. That's the only part that still matters. I've thought a lot about what it actually takes to see something you don't want to see. Not the dramatic kind of seeing, not catching someone red-handed, not a confession, not a scene. The quieter kind. The kind where you notice a pattern and your brain offers you 17 reasonable explanations before it finally goes still and lets you look at the obvious one. For months, I handed Trevor every benefit of the doubt I had. I told myself I was tired. I told myself I was stressed. I saw a doctor. I took supplements. I apologized over and over for a symptom that was being done to me. And the thing is, that's not weakness. I want to be clear about that. That's what happens when you love someone and you built a life around the assumption that they're operating in good faith. Trust isn't naive. It's just trust. The problem isn't that I trusted. The problem is that Trevor and Simone understood exactly how much I trusted, and they used it like a tool. What changed everything wasn't courage. It was attention. One Sunday, I didn't drink the wine and I drove myself home and I felt fine. And instead of filing that away as a coincidence, I wrote it down. That's it. That's the whole thing. I paid attention to what my own body was telling me and I took it seriously enough to track it. Somewhere in between all the apologies and the B12 supplements and the self-doubt, I started listening to myself. And once I started, I couldn't stop. There's a version of the story where I confronted Trevor in the kitchen one night and it turned into a scene and nothing was documented and nothing could be proven. I almost did that. The impulse was there, to be loud, to be direct, to demand an explanation. But something made me wait. Something understood that the truth I discovered was fragile and that the only way to protect it was to build around it slowly and carefully until it was stronger than any denial they could offer. That wasn't instinct. That was a choice I made, deliberately, when I was scared and alone and not sure I was right about any of it. That choice is what mattered. Because here is what I know now. On the other side of all of it, the people who tried to erase me were not more powerful than me. They were just more willing to be dishonest. And dishonesty is loud and fast. It moves quickly. It adapts. It fills the room. But it leaves evidence. It leaves patterns. It leaves 19 months of text messages on a phone that a warrant can reach. The truth doesn't disappear just because someone is working hard to hide it. It waits. Trevor and Simone made their choices over a long time with deliberate intent, and those choices had consequences that caught up with them completely. Not because the universe arranged it that way, because I noticed and documented and refused to act until I was ready, and then I acted. The outcome followed directly from what each of us chose to do. I'm 32 years old and I live alone in Portland with a cat named Edmund and a window that faces a courtyard and a life that is entirely, quietly mine. I didn't get here because something rescued me. I got here because I paid attention when it mattered, trusted myself when it was hard, and built something solid from the inside out. That's the only lesson I have. It's not dramatic, but it held.